Bom, boa tarde a todos e a todas. Bem-vindos à continuação do nosso Seminário Internacional Direitas, Fascismos, Bolsonarismo. Lembrando a vocês, o nosso evento é promovido pelo projeto Sprint Política e Pensadores em Rede, pelo grupo de pesquisa Materialismos e pelo Departamento de Filosofia da PUC-Rio. A gente conta com o auxílio luxuoso da tradução simultânea, para a tradução simultânea das palestras internacionais, dos intérpretes formandos do curso de formação de intérpretes de conferências da PUC-Rio. A gente agradece muito a equipe do curso pela disposição e pelo auxílio indispensável deles para a boa realização do evento. E a gente lembra a vocês, se vocês quiserem fazer uso da tradução simultânea, que está disponível apenas no Zoom. Então, se vocês estão nos assistindo no YouTube agora, quiserem fazer uso da tradução simultânea, vocês terão que vir para o Zoom. No Zoom, basta vocês apertarem no canto inferior direito da tela, basta vocês apertarem no íconezinho de globo para a interpretação, e aí vocês vão ter ali a opção, vocês vão poder escolher vão poder escolher a língua na qual vocês vão ouvir o áudio, português ou inglês. Além disso, a gente lembra a quem está nos assistindo que a editora Ubu está oferecendo um desconto especial para os participantes do evento ao longo, né, de todo o mês. O evento se encerra daqui a 2 semanas. Então, quem quiser fazer uso desse desconto pode, nas compras pelo site da editora, usar o código que eu acabei de passar para vocês aqui no chat do Zoom. Bom, era isso de anúncios e avisos. Então, eu apresento para vocês agora o nosso palestrante da primeira sessão de hoje. A gente, né, aproveita para lembrar que a gente tem depois, às 19 horas, uma outra sessão, mas nessa nossa sessão agora, das 16 horas, a gente tem a honra de receber o Alberto Toscano, que é professor de Teoria Crítica na Goldsmiths College, da Universidade de Londres, co-diretor do Centro de Filosofia e Teoria Crítica, na Goldsmiths. O Alberto, ele é autor de 3 livros que eu recomendo muito, os três livros muito diferentes entre si, mas que têm em comum o fato de que eu recomendo muito os 3 para vocês. The Theater of Production, Philosophy and Individuation Between Kant and Deleuze, o Teatro da Produção, Filosofia e Individuação, entre Kant e Deleuze. Fanatism, on the usos of an idea, Fanatismo, sobre os usos de uma ideia, e, finalmente, coescrito com o Jeff Kinkle, Cartographies of the Absolute, Cartografias do Absoluto. O Alberto é editor da revista Historical Materialism, foi professor visitante em diversas universidades internacionais, atualmente é professor visitante na Simon Fraser University, no Canadá, e atualmente também, e é justamente por isso que nós o convidamos para esse evento, ele está trabalhando num livro sobre as formas contemporâneas do vírus fascista, como, para usar a expressão que ele vai usar na fala dele. Então, Alberto, eu passo a palavra para você. Seja bem-vindo.
Okay.
Welcome. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So I wanted to begin then by thanking Rodrigo and the whole of the organizing team of this conference for the invitation to what is such an urgent and compellingly curated series of discussions, and indeed for including me among such excellent, if unfortunately virtual and deferred company. And of course, as ever, one can only hope and wish for some more contact in the future around these urgent matters. I wanted to start with a brief epigram from an unpublished text by Karl Polanyi from 1934, a text which, whilst unpublished, one can find in a scanned manuscript on a Polanyi repository online, where he writes, "The problem of fascism is as old as capitalism. The threat was there from the start." And I think there's something worth meditating about this phrase, and I'll hope to touch on some of the elements that might clarify or expand upon Polanyi's meaning. Now, while the practical work of halting and reversing the catastrophic global march of the right is on most fronts still lacking in sufficient strategy and force, this conference program alone, I think, testifies to the wealth of analytical, theoretical, and historical acumen that has made the international debate on the new faces of reaction so vibrant and vital today. So I'd like to make a small contribution to the forging of a kind of collective compass to orient ourselves in this extremely grim political and social conjuncture. I want to do so by addressing some of the problems that arise in revisiting the theoretical debate on fascism amid an epoch, our own, whose governing ideology and dominant class strategy many still think best captured by the idea or the term of neoliberalism, however mutant, recombinant, or terminal this neoliberalism may be. How, I want to ask, are we to conceptualize the connection between novel variants of what Karl Polanyi once termed the fascist virus on the one hand, and the mutable instantiations of neoliberalism on the other? And how can we move beyond the familiar, if I will argue fallacious frame of a kind of radical incompatibility between these two heterogeneous complexes of political ideas and practices? Can perhaps a more nuanced theorization of the place of the state in fascist and neoliberal practice provide some insight into the fascist potentials harbored by our current moment? Now, received wisdom would suggest that at the core of historical fascisms lay a violent aversion towards liberalism in all its guises and unchecked worship of the state as the hallowed vehicle for national and racial rebirth through various forms of inner and outer directed violence. In other words, as the Italian regime philosopher Giovanni Gentile himself affirmed, fascism would be a statolatry, by analogy with the term idolatry, obviously. Now, this term would soon thereafter, that is to say 1931, 1932, be employed pejoratively in an encyclic by Pope Pius XI and critically analyzed in a very interesting note by Gramsci in his notebooks. Conversely, the common sense about neoliberalism, the one that many of the authors speaking at this conference have sought quite successfully to dismantle, has regarded it as driven by a veritable phobia of the state, a desire to limit the state's interventionist inroads into the freedoms of the market. Now, in spite, but in a sense also because of its paeans to the total state, fascism could, contrary to, again, received wisdom, be understood as a simultaneous exasperation and dismantling of the modern figure of the state. Not a Hobbesian Leviathan, but, to borrow the title of Franz Neumann's pioneering analysis of Nazism, as a non-state, that's the term that Neumann coined, a behemoth, from these two figures, of course, drawn from Hobbes, for whom, of course, behemoth was the mythical monstrous figure of civil war. What Neumann saw as an unstable, polycratic racial imperialism that accelerates the social contradictions of monopoly capitalism, in what Vicky Yakovou has called a form of society where direct domination over the population takes place, a domination based upon the negation of the mediations deriving from the existence of a relatively independent and stable authority like the state. Or what, again, paraphrasing Neumann, Bernard Harcourt has called an irrational, chaotic, lawless, anarchic condition of domination without a coherent political theory, a non-state that forcibly kept the economy going for the power accumulation of a leader and the profit of the large industrial capitalists. Now, it is no accident that Neumann forged his analysis in ideological struggle with his former mentor, Carl Schmitt, who, in his 1933 text, Staat, Bewegung, Volk, State, Movement, People, had sought to give doctrinal form to the sublation of the independence of the state by the Führerprinzip, the principle of leadership, and its ontology of race and force. While, of course, disavowing, as Schmitt inevitably did, the capitalist gangsterism that Neumann so clinically details. Neumann's close friend, Herbert Marcuse, echoed these insights, and in the process countered the thesis, or opposed the thesis shared by their fellow Institute for Social Research members Pollock and Horkheimer, according to whom Nazism had spawned a historically new and potentially stable form of state capitalism. So Neumann's idea of the non-state was precisely pitted against, right? This notion that it was a new form of state capitalism as proposed by Friedrich Pollock. For Marcuse, again, in affinity with his friend Neumann, Nazism had effectively abolished the distinction between state and society on which the concept of the former, that is the state, depended, leading to a volatile situation based on what Marcuse called a direct and immediate self-government by the prevailing social groups over the rest of the population. This is in a fascinating text called State and Individual Under National Socialism, which was not published at the time. I think it was a working text from 1942. And you'll find now in the volume of Marcuse's collected works, at least in English, called Technology, War, Fascism, which is a fascinating collection in its own right. So in Nazism, Marcuse saw a de facto abolition, not just of the modern figure of the state, but of modern law, which Marcuse finds legitimated and mystified this abolition in Schmitt's argument. And Schmitt is directly quoted in Marcuse's text, for what Schmitt called a plurality of orders that would rescind any even notional transcendence or impartiality of law. If one may still speak of totalitarianism here, there is no such thing for Marcuse or Neumann stricto sensu as a totalitarian state. In a situation where there obtains instead a threefold sovereignty, this is Neumann's and Marcuse's shared vision, of capital, party, and army, and in which Hitler himself operated as a kind of locus, volatile locus of compromise. The state thus becoming merely, in Marcuse's formulation, the government, and I think it's a striking formulation, right? The government of hypostasized economic, social, and political groups. In this sense, not a totalitarian state, but what Marcuse also called a machine state, whose performance was measured by its efficiency in terms, of course, of the interests of these groups themselves. The state, as he noted, seems to move by its own necessity and is still flexible and obedient to the slightest change in the setup of the ruling groups. All human relations are absorbed by the objective wheelwork of control and expansion. Now, rather than echoing the rather undialectical juxtaposition between market society on the one hand and totalitarianism that some members of the Frankfurt School in exile were articulating at the time, so I'm thinking, for instance, of a very important text in many ways, which was the research project on anti-Semitism drafted by Adorno in 1941, where you get very much this, this idea that the abolition of market society was a conditio sine qua non of Nazism. Contrary to this position, Marcuse pointed to the complex genetic and structural relationship between fascism and liberal capitalism, something he had, of course, already begun to sketch out in the landmark 1934 essay called The Struggle Against Liberalism and the Totalitarian View of the State, an essay that was then republished in the volume Negations. Where, of course, Marcuse also noted the great neoliberal figure Ludwig von Mises' notorious reference in his 1927 Liberalism, the book Liberalism, to fascism as, I quote from von Mises, quoted also by Marcuse, as a savior of Western civilization, albeit an emergency makeshift to be later supplanted by a fortified liberal order. Now, there's a passage in Marcuse's 1942 text State and Individual under National Socialism, which I think is really remarkable in this sense for trying to articulate this relationship between fascism and liberalism in a way that goes against, let's say, received wisdom or doxa. And I wanted to quote it at some length, partly also because this text, I think, is rather neglected in a lot of the literature on fascism, and even on fascism and the Frankfurt School. So this is what Marcuse writes. He says, "The emergence of the Third Reich is the emergence of the most efficient and ruthless competitor. The National Socialist state is not the reversal, but the consummation of competitive individualism. The regime releases all those forces of brutal self-interest which the democratic countries have tried to curb and combine with the interest of freedom. Like any other form of individualist society, National Socialism operates on the basis of private ownership in the means of production. Accordingly, it is made up of two polar strata, the small number of those who control the productive process and the bulk of the population, which directly or indirectly is dependent upon the former. Under National Socialism, it is the status of the individual in this latter stratum, so the subaltern or the mass of the population, that has most drastically changed. Here too, however, the changes bring to fruition, rather than contradict, certain tendencies of individualist society." That's end of quote. So much for these preliminary comments on the fascist non-state as this volatile arena for the political and economic power competitions driven and legitimated by what Neumann called race imperialism. So what then about the second, let's say, bit of theoretical or proto-political common sense that I wanted to challenge, just to articulate a different relationship, right, between neoliberalism and fascism, different theoretical relationship. So what then about this notion that neoliberalism can be adequately grasped as a state phobia, as a kind of economic war machine set on dismantling state capacities? Now, this very widespread and, of course, eminently useful fable has been amply dispelled by all serious recent research on the real intellectual and political history of neoliberalism, not least by several of the speakers in this very seminar series. In their powerful polemical history of neoliberalism, the recently published Le Choix de la Guerre Civile, The Choice of Civil War, Pierre Dardot and his co-authors encapsulate this position with trenchant clarity. This position, this counter, right, to the common sense about state phobia. As their history chronicles, from Santiago de Chile to Maastricht, Brasilia to Washington, D.C., as they write, there is no neoliberalism other than an authoritarian one. Since at its core lies what they term the sovereignty of private right guaranteed by a strong power, or in a slogan shared by Schmidt as well as by various figures then linked to neoliberalism, a strong state for a free market. It's a very Thatcherite slogan as well, right? This constitutively implies, to quote from them again, a political project of the neutralization of socialism in all its forms, and beyond this, of all the forms of a demand for equality, a project born by theorists and essayists who are also from the start political entrepreneurs. To this end, they continue, the neoliberal social construction restructures state-society relations not with the aim of weakening the state, but rather with that of reinforcing state institutions which create and fortify the disciplinary power of markets. End of quote. Now, I think if we wish to attend to what I have termed, I've pointed to in the very title of this talk as the fascist potentials in neoliberalism, I think it is particularly imperative, though, to attend to those analyses of neoliberalism that foreground the shaping function of race and racism in the development and implementation of neoliberal policies and ideology. To be more precise, I think we can say that attending to neoliberalism's racial regimes provides incomparable evidence for the thesis that it enacts a differential reinforcement of the state, which in its turn compounds and refunctions those fatal couplings of power and difference that, according to Stuart Hall, define the making, unmaking, and remaking of race. In a very nice line from a text against Carl Schmitt from 1932 called Authoritarian Liberalism, the social democratic jurist Hermann Heller, I think, captured certainly an aspect of this differential reinforcement of the state by saying that the nature of authoritarian liberalism, and we could say even more so the nature of fascism, is to be strong with the weak and weak with the strong. Now, in this regard, I think that much is to be gained by exploring a conceptual and analytical formula advanced by the geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore in the ambit of her ongoing political and geographical investigation of the nexus of state capacities, class warfare, and racialization in the so-called prison industrial complex, a notion that I want to, in a sense, refunction or expand into the terrain of our discussions here today. I'm referring to a notion already incorporated into my title, namely that of the anti-state state. So I wanted to sort of lay this out, especially for people who might not have already come across this work. Now, in a 2008 essay co-authored with her partner Craig Gilmore called, nicely, Restating the Obvious, we're provided with some key elements for a materialist analysis of the place of the state in the reactionary political cycle in which we find ourselves. I'd like briefly to itemize 3 of them here in view of suggesting their usefulness as tools with which to think our present. First, an analytical distinction between state and government. A state is here defined as a, quote, a territorially bounded set of relatively specialized institutions that develop and change over time in the gaps and fissures of social conflict, compromise, and cooperation. While, on the other hand, governments are, in their words, the animating forces, policies plus personnel, that put state capacities into motion and orchestrate or coerce people in their jurisdictions to conduct their lives according to centrally made and enforced rules. End of quote. In this view, the state is fundamentally understood in terms of capacities, that is, materially enacted and enforceable powers, powers to distribute or hierarchize, to develop or to abandon, to care or to criminalize, and so on. By way of a corollary, we can note that one of the chief aims of neoliberalism, especially in its overweening obsession with constitutionalizing and baking in a market order, is to embed its principles into these state capacities themselves, so that, as we have seen many times over the past few decades, even a nominally socialist or social democratic government would still be compelled to carry out neoliberal policies. So in some sense, the state would be so structured at its juridical and administrative level that the policies or ideologies of the government would be nugatory. Second, in polities structured by the long legacies and mutable modes of racial capitalism, the state is also a racial state, one that may well operate administratively and juridically, as in Gilmore's example, the US has in the past decades, by a manifest or notional commitment to so-called colorblindness. As Gilmore's right, in a passage that ably encapsulates the virtues of a historical materialist geographical sensibility when it comes to the nexus of politics and race, I quote, this is, I think, quite a very important insight. They write, the state's management of racial categories is analogous to the management of highways or ports or telecommunication. Racist ideological and material practices are infrastructure that needs to be updated, upgraded, and modernized periodically. This is what is meant by racialization. And the state itself, not just interests or forces external to the state, is built and enhanced through these practices. Sometimes these practices result in protecting certain racial groups, and other times they result in sacrificing them. End of quote. Third, while the state has, of course, been an integral material and symbolic partner across the history of capitalism in general, the present has come to be defined by a singular rhetoric bound to the trajectory of neoliberalism, but also exceeding it, namely that of the anti-state state. A state that promises its own demise, and which, or at the very least, its shrinkage, its planned shrinkage, so to speak, and which employs that promise to increase, intensify, and differentiate its capacities, and of course, the targets of its violence, or indeed of its privilege. This comes in various versions. There's, of course, the combative version. Think of Reagan's dictum, right? The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, in his famous speech. Or think of how this is doubled by fatalistic academic apologias. Think of the mantras of globalization as the eclipse of the state that we all had to imbibe during the long 1990s of, dodgy social theory. Now, contrary to a vision of mass incarceration as the outcome of a drive to privatize, the extraordinary racialized growth in prisons to work with the obviously with the political conjuncture and structure that is addressed in Gilmore's argument is internal to and emblematic of the transmutations in the state. in the composition of its agents and capacities, which a one-dimensional understanding of neoliberalism would often obscure by simply thinking that neoliberalism in terms of mass incarceration would just be a matter of privatization or profit or something so univocal, right? As the Gilmores note, I quote, because prisons and prisoners are part of the structure of the state, they enable governments to establish state legitimacy through a claim to provide social protection combined with their monopoly on the delegation of violence. It's important that they say delegation, obviously, because this can be delegated to, so-called private entities as well, of course. The state establishes legitimacy precisely because it violently dominates certain people and thereby defines them and makes them visible to others as the sort of people who should be pushed around. In modeling behavior for the polity, the anti-state state naturalizes violent domination, which I think is a very important insight into the actually existing logic of so-called neoliberalism. It is noteworthy that in articulating the entanglement of the prison industrial complex with what they term the anti-state state, a state that grows on the promise of shrinking, the Gilmores link back to Tony Negri's pioneering analyses of the crisis state in the late 70s, and in particular to his lucid contention that, to quote a passage that they themselves refer to in this essay, Negri says, the counter-revolution of the capitalist entrepreneur today can operate strictly within the context of an increase, only operate strictly within the context of an increase in the coercive powers of the state. The new right ideology of laissez-faire implies as its corollary the extension of new techniques of coercive and state intervention into society at large. End of quote. However, what Negri's vantage point, that of the mass mobilizations and creeping civil war of the Italian 1970s, may not have fully equipped him to grasp, and what we need to dwell on to discern the fascist potentials in the anti-state state, are the forms of subjective participation in naturalizing violent domination that go together with a certain promotion of a kind of possessive and racialized conception of freedom. Here, I think it is imperative to reflect on the fact, not just that neoliberalism operates through a racial state, or that as commentators have begun to recognize and detail at some length, it is shaped by a racist and civilizational imaginary that overdetermines who is capable of market freedoms. Remember von Mises' claim about fascism saving Western civilization. Rather, I think we also need to attend to the fact that the anti-state state could only become an object of popular attachment, or better, populist investment, through the mediation of racial discourses and practices. In his germinal analyses of Thatcherism, Stuart Hall demonstrated, in ways that I think are still profoundly pertinent to our present, how populist authoritarianism, or authoritarian populism, gestated in the 1960s and 1970s around a concatenation of racialized moral panics. Obviously, the case he's working with is the one of England or of the United Kingdom, but of course we can think of analogous or related phenomena in many of the domains and scenarios that concern us here. This played a key mediating, consolidating, and reproducing function for the rise of neoliberalism to political preeminence. And in a sense, it could also be seen as a kind of conditio sine qua non, and not just in the UK. Racism was in this sense a kind of supplement internal to neoliberalism. In Hall's Gramscian terminology, it made possible, under the specific conditions of a crisis-racked England, as he puts it, neutralizing the contradiction between the people and the state power bloc and winning popular interpellations so decisively for the right. Authoritarian populism can, in keeping with this, be understood as, again quoting from Hall, the project central to the politics of Thatcherism to ground neoliberal politics directly. This is Hall writing in the 1980s, right? Quite prophetic way. The project central to the politics of Thatcherism to ground neoliberal politics directly in an appeal to the people, to root them in the essentialist categories of common sense experience and practical moralism, and thus to construct, not simply awaken classes, groups, and interests into a particular definition of the people. This construction was and remains racialized by successive figurations of the non or unpeople, from young Black proletarians figured as muggers in the late 1970s, to Muslims viewed as on a constant path to so-called radicalization, to most recently Eastern European workers in the context of the Brexit debates. In its English variant, neoliberalism in power was first articulated as a national populism, and indeed in the Falklands venture as a kind of social imperialism 2.0, and such it remains. whence the critical function of vanishing mediators, such as Enoch Powell, whose more overt and combative racist rhetoric seeded a more capacious successor. For Hall, the ideological crusade of the mid-1970s, Negri's counter-revolution of the capitalist entrepreneur, required penetration into some of the core and root social ideas in the population, and the staging of a kind of popular ventriloquism that could draw on the real material sources of popular discontent and secure the people to the practices of the dominant bloc, drawing on what he viewed as the massively conservative force of traditional and uncorrected common sense. In this respect, by contrast with its social democratic, in the UK, Labour antecedent, this authoritarian populist neoliberalism effected, in his view, a kind of passive revolution from below, grounded in unceasing efforts to construct the movement towards a more authoritarian regime from a massive populist base. Hall, of course, was foregrounding the specificity of Thatcherism by critical contrast with a facile Marxist stance that flattened all authoritarianism onto a familiar fascist specter, a lesson that remains valid today. And yet, I don't think it's irrelevant to ask in what way a neoliberalism, which entered power as a nationalist or indeed imperialist populism, instrumentalizing racialized moral panics and racialized and gendered class struggles, also seeded the present conditions for their contemporary resurgence of the far right, a far right which, in its own distinctive ways, to quote Marcuse, is based, I quote, not on the reversal, but the consummation of competitive individualism. As evidenced in US, UK, Brazilian, German, and other scenarios, there are no fixed and tidy doctrinal barriers between combative neoliberalisms and the many modes of the contemporary far right, including neo or post-fascist ones. It is useful to recall here Dardot and his collaborators' contention that neoliberalism cannot be positively defined by a specific political regime. Here, they write, lies the heart of the authoritarian dimension of neoliberal politics. The structure of the state may vary, the political personnel and its behavior too. What is essential is that those in government may be sufficiently strong to impose the constitutionalization of private right and thus restrict the field of what can be deliberated upon. Now, end of quote. Now, whether a revanchist right-wing populism may wittingly or otherwise threaten that constitutionalization is not clear. Even today's protectionisms remain within the broader ambit of neoliberalism and its class imperatives. Perhaps rather than these doctrinal issues, often blurred by the marked ideological flexibility of the right, we should attend to the social and political trajectories that bind the possibilities of fascist resurgence to neoliberalism's morbid symptoms. Here, I find it useful to recall Grégoire Chamayou's recent analysis of the birth of what he calls authoritarian liberalism after this text by Hermann Heller against Schmidt in the fateful year of 1932 and its unsettling resonances with the present. Namely in what he calls the Austerian, as in austerity, the Austerian authoritarian mechanism. The socially disastrous effects of a government's rejected economic program sapped the threadbare political basis on which it could still rely, so that it soon could not continue in the same direction, save by going up a notch in its authoritarianism in order to impose measures of the same kind that produce the same genre of effects, and so on. Not only does the anti-state state manifest itself as a series of punitive responses to the very chaos it has facilitated, but as Hugo Paletta has exhaustively shown for the French case, the protracted crises of hegemony and social reproduction affected by neoliberal policies have considerably and determinedly contributed to the flourishing of fascist potentials. The 2007 and 2008 crisis was of a special moment in this respect in France and elsewhere, revealing that neoliberalism is unable to generate socially acceptable solutions, or viable ones, opening up a seemingly endless horizon of austerity, stagnation, declining living standards, increasing inequality, and a repressive and very often racialized hardening of the state against any challenge or alternative. The recombinations of neoliberalism itself manifest this hardening of authoritarian tendencies in a context increasingly of domination without hegemony, in which the ruling classes themselves undergo a process of radicalization and where their continued supremacy is dependent on hollowing out democratic rights and resources. Here, it is difficult not to recall Karl Polanyi's astute dictum that, quote, in order to comprehend German fascism, we must revert to Ricardian England, and his related observation according to which fascism was merely the outcome of the mutual incompatibility of democracy and capitalism at our time, that revolutionary solution which keeps capitalism untouched. Behind this lay the thesis, gestured at in the epigram to this talk, of a longue durée of fascist potentials, grounded in what he called the recrudescence of the old hostility of capitalism to popular government, a hostility which he traces all the way back to Edmund Burke, if not before. The incompatibility between a substantive socioeconomic notion of democracy, such as Polanyi's, is something that the anti-state state, as the rhetoric and practice of neoliberalism, does not just share with the new faces of reaction. It creates the material and ideological conditions for efforts to win popular interpolations for the right in the electoral arena and beyond. The modality through which fascist potentials or trajectories emerge out of neoliberalism's disruptive strains involves turbocharging several inherent traits of the neoliberal order: the spoliation of nature for the sake of profit, attacks on the distribution of the social wage, glorification of possessive individualism, and so on. All of this happening under the cover of a challenge to some of its supposedly defining dimensions. The anti-statism of the contemporary right marries culture war themes and corporate interests, especially, as Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective have recently shown, those of fossil capital, and culminates in visions such as that of Steve Bannon's famous call in 2017 for the deconstruction of the administrative state, I quote. And it explicitly combines this with a revanchist ethno-nationalism passionately attached to the symbolism and reality of the repressive state. Think, in the US case, of thin blue line American flags, Blue Lives Matter slogans, and so on. What have elsewhere called late fascism is thus both a reaction against certain facets, a surface reaction against certain facets of the neoliberal moment, those which come to be coated and often racialized as globalist, as in, the evil figures of George Soros and the like, and a kind of over-identification with the coercive dimensions of the anti-state state, as well as an explicit assumption and affirmation of neoliberalism's historical reliance on civilizational narratives of white superiority and its transformations of the infrastructure of the racial state. This late fascism comes after a neoliberalism that has failed in its impossible neutralization of the political. It is a kind of second-order affirmation of neoliberalism's authoritarian underside, which is now subjectively sustained by the blurring between liberal conceptions of freedom and individualism, as market freedom, freedom to own, freedom from interference with individual sovereignty, and so on, and what we could term, in a phrase that I think is only apparently paradoxical, fascist conceptions of freedom: freedom to dominate, freedom to rule, and so on. Both hovering around aggressive imaginaries of inevitable competition and the repulsion, hence the extreme misogyny that has always accompanied fascist imaginaries of solidarity, care, and vulnerability. Those whose horizon remains in one way or another that of the root and branch transformation of the state, understood as a condensation and vehicle of class power and social violence, horizon that was once termed in communist circles that of the non-state state, will have to continue, I think, to contend with the social and ideological dynamics that entangle and embed fascist potentials within neoliberalism's anti-state state. Potentials that may, perhaps already are, organizing themselves around new forms of the appropriative entrepreneurial violence that defined Neumann's behemoth as what he called a non-state. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. Muito obrigado, Alberto. Eu não tinha dito antes, então eu digo agora. A gente, para quem está aqui no Zoom, vocês podem tanto fazer as perguntas, vocês podem mandar as perguntas de vocês pelo chat, ou vocês podem pedir para que a gente, pelo chat, pedir para que a gente ligue o microfone de vocês, para vocês fazerem as perguntas de vocês de viva voz. E vocês podem fazer a pergunta tanto em inglês quanto em português. Se vocês fizerem em português, os nossos intérpretes traduzem a pergunta para o Alberto. Para quem está nos acompanhando pelo YouTube, a gente está monitorando o chat do YouTube também. Se vocês quiserem mandar perguntas por lá, a gente pode trazê-las para cá. Alguém já tem alguma pergunta para dar partida ao debate? Não teve, ninguém se manifestou pelo chat por enquanto. Não, lá no YouTube também não teve nada ainda, né? Então,
eu tenho uma pergunta, se ninguém tiver.
vai lá.
Hello, thank you, Professor Toscano, for your presentation. And I have a question. I agree completely with your description of the fascist potentials in neoliberalism, and I'd like to ask you if you see any difference between how this dynamics goes in Europe and US and the first world, and in the global south. If there is any difference between the new potentials in the north and the south?
I think that's an excellent question, which I suppose I can begin by saying that I'm not entirely equipped, given the scope of the question, to answer with great certainty or detail. I mean, I think the dynamics are also very different within what might might be understood as a global north, right? I mean, the differences between these potentials and the sedimented ideological histories, political histories, the kind of rooted common sense, and also the couplings of power and difference specific to different social formations are pretty intense. Even, let's say, within the bounds of member countries of the European Union or whatever, you can see quite different dynamics, I think. I guess one way of, sort of thinking on my feet a little bit, one way of trying to address this would be, of course, in terms of the specific modalities of implantation, right, of neoliberalism within different situations, right? I think it's very different. For instance, if one thinks of the forms of far-right ethno-nationalist imaginaries currently at work in places like the United States or the United Kingdom, that they often pivot around kind of distorted, racialized nostalgia about the working class, right? And they are articulated around the reality of what Balabar at some point, writing about the French case in particular, called this experience of the national and social state, right? So in some sense, there is this idea of the ethno-national preference and the nostalgia for some perception of the welfare state, some perception of a post-war compact. Now, my distant and very unspecific understanding of this is that, of course, this does not obtain, right? It does not obtain in that way, as that imaginary, in Brazil or in India or in other situations where forms of fascization, let's say, are rather evident in the present. So I think that might, that is one element. So I think the kind of differential or uneven periodization, and the very different, political, class and racial histories that different polities have will provide considerable specificity. Of course, then there is also this other dimension, which is particularly evident at the level of uses of the media, the level of political rhetoric, and so on, which is also a dimension of remarkable convergence, including a circulation of personnel, of think tanks, of political schools, and so on. Steve Bannon traveling around the world, and all of this kind of stuff, which also is an engine of synchronization, right? that kind of unevenness, a repetition of similar slogans in a different sauce, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a tricky situation, because I think one of the things that a lot of the research on both on neoliberalisms, right, and on the far right in the present has pointed to is are those different varieties, right, or variants, as I put them. But those variants come to be, articulated with one another. There are these processes, remarkable processes of mimesis, right, that happen. And that would also be interesting to think through, right, in the long history of fascisms, which we often rather too comfortably think of as enclosed in their national specificities. There were their own forms, right, of internationalism, and their own forms of circulation and the like. And I guess that would also be a question to ask about the present, also in a concrete and empirical sense, like which modes exactly, right, rhetorical, material, political, and otherwise come to converge or to map onto one another. But I do think, just going back to just the kind of initial somewhat inchoate intuition, that I think that there is something about the relationship to at the very least a kind of now ethnicized imaginary of a post-war industrial working class, industrial compact between capital, the state, and the working class that plays, if nothing else, at least a very significant kind of libidinal or fantasy role in the North that is not matched in societies that have very different trajectories of class formation and very different periodizations, right? Yeah.
I guess I'll jump in, because I guess my question is a variation or a variant of that same question. In couched perhaps in terms of asking for clarification regarding your thesis, particularly about how necessary, because that wasn't entirely clear to me in your talk, what exactly the claim was about the necessity or otherwise of these things expressing themselves in racialized terms, or the mobilization of racial themes. So to what extent that is necessary, and if you do believe that is necessary, then if you're thinking of that mobilization not necessarily in direct terms, but also as a mobilization through displacement. You see that very clearly in Stuart Hall's examples in the UK, the way law and order expresses, and that is very clear in the US as well, the way that law and order expresses a racial thing. But I wonder about the Brazilian case, in which it certainly race is part of the package, and you could maybe claim that other parts of the package that appear to be more important are just race displaced, but where at the same time the racial question, if it is a claim that it's necessary that it be there, and so that it is necessarily there, then it appears disguised as a moral question, much more like the moral theme appears to be much more important in Brazil than racial themes are. So yeah, how necessary do you think the mobilization of racial themes is, yeah.
I think, I mean, I don't think it's necessary in the sense that you would ascribe to it some, because that's not the level at which one is having these analyses or arguments, right? So it's not at the level of a kind of ironclad structural ironclad necessity that would be transversal to, you know, the actual political and social history, right, of the different scenarios that we're talking about. I think, I do think, however, starting from kind of Stuart Hall's analysis, that the affixing of the turning of this theoretical model, or this indeed this kind of economic political doctrine, in many ways bloodless, seemingly bloodless, into a rhetorical and ideological machine, you know, as happened under Thatcherism, required, as I think Hall shows very extremely persuasively for the English case or the British case, required, and again, often in displaced ways or not in explicitly, you know, that's the point of the kind of Enoch Powell to Margaret Thatcher way, you know, not that Margaret Thatcher didn't say plenty of pretty transparently racist things, but nevertheless, it wasn't organized, you know, the discourse wasn't organized in the, you know, Enoch Powell mode. He, as ever, in that kind of double movement, right, made possible the those popular, ethnicized, racialized popular attachments that then were expanded to a much broader constituency by, in some sense, euphemizing, right, or combining those themes with other ones that were more palatable to, you know, a much wider kind of voting bloc or political bloc. So, you know, that's, you know, that in a sense was a question of what is the kind of what is the material, the ideological, the social, the class, the historical material that these political projects are working with, right? And so, of course, in the English case, as we've seen even recently, the histories and fantasies and embedded structures that come with this, you know, very particular post-imperial polity, obviously, are weaponized and reinvented and repaired in different ways. That was also one of the very, I think, one of the very problematic blinkers, right, of much of the left vis-a-vis Brexit, that in some way it couldn't realize, because it was quite complex, the articulation between the traditional, so to speak, forms of racism birthed by Britain's racial and colonial history. It couldn't articulate those with the centrality of racism against, you know, notionally white Eastern European migrants in that context. And, you know, shockingly in many ways, like, not that certain people didn't mobilize and organize, but the idea that this massive propaganda against you know, hundreds of thousands of people, you know, proletarians, frankly, working in England, was not a massive racist campaign. You know, that was very, very much evaded, right? And so in that case, you get, you know, it's in a sense like that point that I was quoting from Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Craig Gilmore, right, about this you know, the repair and the transformation in these practices of racialization, and to the extent that welding welding neoliberalism to a kind of national populism necessarily, I think in that sense, does necessarily require forms of enmity, othering, exclusions, etc., which need not be necessarily racial in the sense of the histories of race as we know them in the scenarios of the US or of the UK, etc. And there's no kind of synthetic a priori, right, that will tell us that by necessarily this will always kind of be the core, right? But I think there's a lot, there's a lot of evidence or continued evidence for this, being the case in most of the scenarios that we know, that there are patterns of racialization. Some of them, to say, that might be more deflected, right? But again, the relationship, I guess, between kind of core causes and how they appear is not just like an appearance, right? So if there's a deflection, then that itself needs to be thought about. So let's say if one were to make the argument that these moral crusades that support forms of fascisation within the Brazilian context involve patterns of a deflection of other structures of racism, then one would have to show how those deflection works, much like you say, not by analogy necessarily, but by relation to what Hall said, regarding law and order, which I think is a very good point of comparison. But I do think that for me, certainly, that that model has its analogs in most polities. Now, interestingly enough, for instance, I'm talking to you now from Madrid. In the Spanish case, I think to some extent this is again not through like elaborate empirical work, but just an opinion, right, from reading newspapers and other people's commentaries and the like. I think there's a much, in a sense, almost more formative role in the formation of the far right of this extremely virulent anti-feminism, right? Like, I think even if you just see the kind of, of course, there's all sorts of racial imaginaries. I mean, this is the Vox Party wants the Reconquista. It doesn't get more racial capitalism. That's like, the original variant, right? But I do think
OG racial capitalism.
But I do think that so in that case, I think one can't simply state, like, in this facile axiomatic way that it will always be race and only race that functions to affix neoliberal model to secure popular attachments to it. But I do think the ways in which it has structured most global polities speaks to that. Of course, then the entanglements and the mutual effects of the forms of racialization and gendering, for instance, that happen in fascisation is a very it again has to be studied in these particular contexts. Also because it has to be fought in those particular contexts. There's not much use having some kind of the dry synthetic a priori theory of neoliberalism and race doesn't get you very far, I think. And in some sense, these are just what I was presenting in a way are just again some rather kind of sketchy notes trying to draw what I think from the archive of these debates are positions that might be stimulating or inspiring for contemporary purposes. But I think the level at which these analyses have to take place ultimately is much more the level of Stuart Hall's work or of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work than it would be the level of like, well, here's my general theory of race and capital, which is, I think is just a misplaced, methodologically misplaced desire, maybe.
And as I was listening to you, I was trying to elaborate what the differences were and why they manifested themselves in that way. And I guess probably one of the differences in the Brazilian case is the way in which the whole discourse on miscegenation and racial democracy has always been used, has always been an elite discourse, functioned as an elite discourse precisely to deny the existence of racial conflict. So I guess that's the prevalence of that in public discourse in Brazil, and its historical use as an elite discourse makes it more difficult for those things to manifest themselves directly, while at the same time, like what would be the problem in Brazil is not so much blackness or a worry about blackness or black people, although obviously that is also there, but the problem as it figures in Bolsonarista discourse is the people who it's not Black people per se, it's Black people who are fighting for their rights. It's Black people who, in the same way that, you know, it's not women per se, it's women who are fighting for their rights, or it's not gays per se, it's gays who are fighting for their rights. So there is, it's overlaid with this level of negative solidarity, this repulsion to the idea that anyone would be fighting for their rights, because that is seen as trying to exempt yourself from you know, having to go through the same disciplining and the same suffering as an atomized individual in the market that everyone else has to go through. And at the same time, that is what connects it to anti-communism, which has figured in Brazil as a master discourse in ways that surprised many people, because the way in which, like, this very old Cold War anti-communism has become one of the master discourses in Bolsonarismo was I mean, not many people could see that coming, even though retrospectively it's very clear that it was coming. But I guess that's how it connects to the racial question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I mean that in itself, going back to the earlier question, is one of those you know, family resemblances, or indeed convergences, or circulations of rhetoric, right? Like, if anything brings together also, you know, via these kind of circuits of conspiracy or far-right cognitive mapping, so to speak, all of these planetary rights are these, you know, ridiculously grotesque and impoverished, you know, memes, so to speak, right? Cultural Marxism and this the zombie anti-communism, right? The weird, like, refighting some imaginary Cold War like you role play on weekends, right? You find this, you know, you already found this in these bizarre, like, you know, 2000, you know, and the 2008 Obama election was a kind of remarkable case in point, right? Already in that kind of Tea Party mode, you would have all of those T-shirts and pins of, you know, Obama and hammers and sickles. I mean, like, you know, the guy who didn't even, like, mildly punish Wall Street after, you know, but nevertheless, it was okay, right? Like hammers and sickles everywhere, and the cultural Marxism notions, and that, I think, is, you know, that has a very long, extremely long history, but there is something, I think, of a puzzle for anyone who really wants to study contemporary forms of reaction and anti-fascism, fascism, and therefore think of, anti-fascist politics, etc., about the force, right, of this. I mean, some might see it as, in a kind of quasi-psychoanalytic way, right? Like the repulsion towards any form of solidarity or collectivity as such is so strong that it's the far right that is keeping like the idea of communism alive, right? As something that energizes them on a daily basis in a way that, maybe many so-called progressives would not, right? And then there is the bizarre kind of brew, right, whereby cultural Marxism then shades into gender ideology, which shades into some kind of communist, and and that, of course, goes back to the weaponized incoherence that is such a trait, and alas, a strength in many ways, right, of fascist and far right discourses, all the way down to the bizarre concoctions of Judeo-Bolshevism and so on and so forth. Recently, I wrote an intro for this text that Norbert Gutermann and Leo Lowenthal wrote in the 40s, doing this research on completely marginal, weird, but with some following, but kind of radio sermon and far right agitators on the West Coast in the 30s and 40s, and it's there is something kind of uncanny, right, about the ways in which these what Adorno called these tricks, right, repeat themselves, and now in a sense they've gone from tricks to algorithms, right? Like they could just be automated, like nobody would even need to hold them in their own head because they're kind of so easy to replicate. But I find that really striking, and that persistence, right, of that narrative. And that means, and that's, I guess, one of those puzzles that led me to think, what to use this kind of placeholder notion of late fascism, right? Like in trying to think of these issues, was also to think, well, what happens when we move from the idea of fascism as counter-revolution, which could be also fascism as a counter-revolution against a revolution that's already hit a barrier or a block. So you take the case of Italy and Germany. Obviously, fascism both instrumental in repressing the revolutionary left, but also came after that left was not exactly on the brink of power, right? And then you have the theory that both Marcuse and Angela Davis put forward, I think very compellingly, in their analyses of potentials for fascism in the 1960s, right? The idea that new forms of fascism were a preventive counter-revolution, right? So that in some sense, they were manifest, for instance, in the fascization of a US state that was beginning to, as in the case of Fred Hampton, just execute members of the Black Panthers in order to explicitly, prevent, in the Edgar Hoover sense, the rise of the Black Messiah and so on and so forth, right? But now you have a very odd modality, right? Which is in part a kind of weird form of counter-reform, right? Because all of the objects of obsession of the contemporary far rights are what would be perceived from a far left as, in many regards, reformist formations, right? Like, whether it's changes in education and culture, which are viewed conspiratorially as the victory of the sons and grandsons of Lukács and Adorno, but are just percolations into contemporary neoliberalisms of real struggles, but they're not like the vehicles for some kind of grand communist plot, obviously, right? And they're often quite mild, progressive measures. So and that's, I guess, where you wonder, like, are the mechanisms more psychoanalytic, or do you have to turn, for instance, as Bloch turned in the 30s, or indeed even Lowenthal and Gutermann, to think that there is this kind of almost inverted utopia, right? Like the far right, like, is obsessed with the possibility of the, in a way that's kind of uncanny, right? Like it's obsessed with the possibility of a complete transformation in the way things are, and a complete transformation that somehow is already ongoing, right? Like, so that we're somehow almost in communism if it weren't for, some figures holding it back, right? The other side has almost won, which is, of course, perplexing if you count yourself on the left, right? Cheering in a maybe very contorted way, that they hold a sense of possibility that you might not be so sanguine about. But I think it is kind of unique, right? Like this kind of the zombie belated degraded rehearsal of these things, I think is quite, an enigma.
At least it's nice to know that someone still believes in us, even if it's just the fascists. But actually, something he said segues quite nicely in one of the questions that we got from YouTube. So I'm going to read it in Portuguese, and then the translators can translate it for you. A pergunta é sobre a relação da análise que o Alberto propôs aqui para a gente hoje com a noção da Nancy Fraser de um neoliberalismo progressista que parece, segundo o Pedro Casas, que colocou a pergunta, parece tão apropriado para tratar da democracia brasileira até 2016, quer dizer, da democracia brasileira no interregno lulista ou dos governos do PT. E aí eu já acrescento o acréscimo que o Ronaldo fez à pergunta do Pedro. Existiria um papel da direita tradicional, aquela que não é fascista, para evitar o fortalecimento dessa extrema-direita? Ou, enfim, a gente pode mesmo sequer fazer essa diferenciação entre uma direita tradicional, uma direita, digamos, uma direita que poderia ser neoliberal sem ser fascista, e que teria um papel para evitar o fortalecimento dessa extrema-direita?
I can get this far with the Brazilian Portuguese, so you don't need to translate. That's the Fraser reference and the progressive neoliberalism is I think is an important question. I mean the book that I referred to, the Dardot Laval and their collaborators in this Choix de la Guerre Civile, one of their contentions is, of course, that not as a kind of diabolical plot, but de facto, the past decades have seen this saturation, right, of the political space by this seemingly polarized relationship between the progressive neoliberalism and its authoritarian, it's more explicitly or affirmatively authoritarian or authoritarian populist variants, right? And so in that respect, then there will be something, and I think there's a point to that, would be something really emblematic, for instance, about the U.S. political scene, right, where like the kind of Biden-Trump election, right, that somehow actually vast tenets of neoliberal practice and doctrine are evidently shared. But this takes place in forms of what seems to be like an epical polarization between completely and utterly different kind of perspectives. And for them, this is all kind of functions to magnetize and trap, kind of progressive energies and so on and so forth. And I think there's a kind of truth to that, of course, and I think they are correct that in many ways there is, part of the seeding of this potential obviously has to do not just with, say, Thatcherism and these, more obviously right-wing forms of neoliberalism, but obviously has to do with, the phase, I guess, emblematically figured by Clinton and Blair, right? I guess the issue is whether we view the potentials at the level of policy and doctrine, or whether we view the potentials more in terms of social and political dynamics, right? And I guess if one thinks of social and political dynamics rather than doctrinal elements or policies or ideologies per se, then the responsibilities of that progressive neoliberalism for the emergence or the fortification or the coalescence of these far rights is pretty considerable, right? I won't speak to the Brazilian case because I can't in this regard about and I think it's a very different, I think that logic is very different, it seems to me from a distance, than the one that would see a much greater continuity, right, between Thatcherism, Blairism, and the return of the Tories under austerity. I mean, even if you see it right from that sad institutional vantage point, which is the institutional and infrastructural life of universities, right? There was massive continuity all along the way, and if you see it from those observatories, right, then you don't get a sense of some great ruptures, right, in many ways, and often famously, policies were implemented, right, under the progressive variant of neoliberalism that the right-wing variant couldn't have gone away with because it would have generated far too much social conflict, right, or hadn't gotten around to it, right? Like that's the other argument you could say, vis-a-vis Thatcher, say, and privatization of the universities or what have you. But in any case, so I think, it's not necessarily kind of a question of responsibilities in some moral sense, but I do think that certainly, I think calling it progressive neoliberalism seems fair enough to me. Like those formations, not just in the UK and in the US, but certainly, in Italy, you could argue, in many ways in Spain. Certainly that was a critique here, right, of the transition, right? Like the transition was a form of, neoliberalism, possibly not the right term, but in any case of a kind of progressive compromise, right, with the baking in of capitalist social relations, with then immensely disruptive effects a la Polanyi down the road when the crunch and the crisis affected themselves, right? And therefore losing, also a way of dismantling the political infrastructures that allowed people to, or would have allowed people to react in ways that were less regressive, right? In terms of the second question, I think again, that is something to be thought about in the specificity of different, national contexts. Obviously, there is no such thing as a traditional right in the United States anymore. You could argue would have that kind of holding back formation. In fact, by other standards, the center of the Democratic Party is pretty right wing. It's like kind of, Christian Democrats in European context, right? Like on the spectrum, so to speak. And I think, going back to the point I made before, and I think this Ugo Paletta book, the Trajectory of Disaster in France, I think is very effective in that sense, in seeing how the ways in which the center and center right, or the progressive neoliberal center left, responded to the sequence of social crises in different ways, gave a lot of the weapons, or created the conditions, right? Created the conditions. not just the exacerbation of inequality, but for instance already, and this is evident across the board of so-called progressive neoliberal formations or even traditional right formations in the past 20 years, by, in a euphemized way, intensifying the repressive racialization of politics. I mean, just think of so-called immigration policy across Europe when so-called social democrats were ruling, or et cetera, right? So so in that sense, I think the idea in this context, might not be in other contexts, but in the context that we find ourselves, and I think partly because it is a context of instability, of instability at the economic level, and obviously very much so and increasingly so at the ecological level, I think that idea of a stabilizing force for a certain traditional right, it just doesn't obtain in any scenario that I can think of, right? Because I also do think that there's a kind of materiality to the polarization, which has to do with the untenability of the social order that we live in, that doesn't allow for the hope that some stability or respite would be given by forces which, yes, accept neoliberalism, but not with its worst aspects. Because the worst aspects have to be there, right? Like in some sense, the authoritarian aspects are increasingly necessary the more the material conditions are untenable, right? And that's, I guess, what I think is very astute in that kind of formulation, that the way that Chamayou reads, right, like 1932, these increasingly, the increasing repressive drift of the German right, well, of also even of German social democracy to a certain extent, right, creating the, and all of the initial attempts to say, oh, we need to take, we need to take these authoritarian measures in order to stop the worst from coming, obviously just generate the very conditions for the worst to come, right? So I think in that sense, yeah, as the Labour Prime Minister Jim Callaghan once said, alas, of the welfare state in its post-war form, that option no longer exists, right? So that was one great prophetic declaration before there is no alternative. I think in this instance, the idea of the sensible right holding the fascist wolves at bay, that option no longer exists either. If it ever quite, it might have done so in the post-war period in certain places, but not now for sure.
That part certainly rings true in Brazil. There is, we could say, the middle term between Callaghan and Thatcher would be, there is an alternative, just not for us. The two would meet in Kafka. Did we get any more questions from YouTube? No. So do we have any more questions here? Perdão. A gente tem mais alguma pergunta aqui no Zoom. Pensem, levem em conta que se vocês não fizerem a pergunta de vocês agora, vocês terão perdido a oportunidade para sempre. Não necessariamente para sempre. Mas, enfim, por agora, pelo menos. Então, pensem com cuidado. Mas pensem rápido também para fazer a pergunta.
Eu tenho mais uma pergunta, assim, se ninguém tiver.
Então, vai lá.
My question is, we see that these authoritarian measures are enacted in order to give a constitutional framework according in affinity with neoliberalism. You are seeing this now in Brazil, pretty clear. Bolsonaro's government is trying to subvert the constitution in order to cut off all the social democrat elements that is in it. And the problem is And I think that maybe, I don't know, I would like to ask you what you think. A difference between this process in more institutional stable countries like UK and US and here in Brazil, because the class struggle here is more acute, I guess, than in the North. And so there is a radical a radicalization of the means necessary to establish such a neoliberal framework. And what we're seeing is a lot of threats to the institutions. They are based on law and the constitution, in certain ways, stopping the progress of this neoliberal regime and totalitarian regime. And in response to that, the Bolsonaro government are threatening the institutions with coup d'etat and openly creation of a dictatorship in clear fascist features, and including some pre-read and utilization of National Socialism icons here in Brazil. Let's counter that. Hitler would kill all of us, but still his basis is going to this level of radicalization in order to openly and not like subtle with legal measure here and there. No, just openly subvert the constitutional order in order to create a new liberal authoritarian regime. And so I would like to ask you if you see this also happening in other countries in the First World, or if not, just like to be a difference between the North and Global South in this respect.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, this is going more on a very generic and secondhand knowledge, but I think those attacks, which often then manifest themselves in struggles, for instance, with the judicial wing, and forms of that sort, not necessarily all having to do with baking in neoliberalism, right? They might also have to do with other forms of authoritarian policies. I think variants of that have definitely been seen in Turkey, in India, without even going into, other cases. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think what you, and again, I kind of referring back to that book by Derrida and his collaborators, right? Like there's a kind of implicit and at times latent or creeping form of social war, right? Which involves preventing or curtailing demands for equality or for democracy or for participation. But of course, like you say, I think the intensity and the openness of social conflict, right, obviously means that the same principles, the same desiderata of certain groups and can't be implemented without open shows of force, and therefore also of para or illegality, right? And sometimes that can be, yeah, sometimes that can manifest itself in a much more explicit coup-like way. At other times, it can be more circuitous, I think. So, and I think that's why, that's why for many, the whole, for many people writing about neoliberalism, right, that part of the reason, I think, that the analysis of the history of neoliberalism's relationship to the Chilean dictatorship, but of course one could speak of other dictatorships in Latin America and elsewhere, is so significant, right? Because in some sense you do have that correlation, right, between the intensity of the actual challenge, right? Not the imaginary cultural Marxism, but like the actual culture of Marxism and its politics as a raison d'être, right, for the militarization, right, of these neoliberal kind of principles. So yeah, I think that, you know, that makes a lot of sense. Now, it's, you know, it's also true that, of course, we've seen in a different vein and with different ideological and political features, a great intensification of incursions into constitutional and juridical safeguards, right, by various authorities in the so-called stable and so-called advanced North, right? You know, thinking also recently of all this, you know, the kind of legislation by decree that, you know, is been completely normalized, very much also through terror and security laws by Macron, for instance, in France. But you know, you see a lot of those phenomena. So you know, and not all of them, you know, it's not like a kind of functionalist thing where all of these things are neoliberal in some kind of univocal way. Many of them have very little to do in any straightforward sense, right, with neoliberal doctrine or practice. But I do think that you know, that really, you know, and that might be also one of the, not antinomies, but like ambiguities, right, of like actually existing neoliberalism, that you know, complicated relationship between the executive and the executive's potentially kind of proto-dictatorial or exceptional rule, right? Poulantzas has talked about fascism indeed as an exceptional state, and on the other hand, the favored path, let's say, quite explicitly so, of neoliberals, which is precisely that kind of constitutionalization, as might be seen happening in the context of the European Union, at least to a great extent, that doesn't require any, you know, open fanfare or you know, anything particularly conflictual. In fact, that its point is kind of to neutralize. So that, you know, it's I do think the, you know, the kind of null hypothesis, or the basic process, obviously, you know, the basic intention, right, at least of explicitly neoliberal thinkers and practitioners, is the you know, the stealthier the stealthier path, precisely because it's the one that neutralizes the very conflict that would then make the implementation of these mechanisms, and indeed the health of the markets, much more volatile, right? So that kind of makes sense. So that moment is also a very you know, ambiguous moment. And it was also an ambiguous moment in the Chilean case, right? It's not like it's like 11 September 1973. It's like, here's neoliberalism. It takes ages. It's a quite conflictual process. You know, initially, of necessity, there are a lot of elements of so-called nationalization, you know, et cetera, right? So that's a tricky, it's kind of a very tricky scenario, I think. But I think that difference that you point out is obviously very significant. And while I think in the US case, there was kind of like vastly exaggerated in many respects, like, but, you know, progressive neoliberals like kind of enjoyed their fantasies of like, this was like a full-blown attempt at a coup d'etat. It's like, well, not quite by international standards, right? But at the same time, you know, those virtualities, those tendencies were to some extent there, right? Of trying to bypass those constitutional juridical. You know. It was like all of those anecdotes of, you know, Trump like, can we do this? Like, no, sir, you can't. You know, that kind of mode, which at least speaks to some of the potentials, right? Yeah, and I guess here too, vis-a-vis the differences, what we haven't talked about is also the, you know, which is crucial, right? Like the very different investments that that capitalist classes, or fractions of capitalist classes, to use that kind of terminology, have in these political projects, right? And when and how are they willing to bet on them, given the instability and conflict that they might bring, and also the potential erosion of their interests or their business or their profits. So, you know, and that, for instance, in the US is a very you know, complex issue, which allows then the right, to some extent, to make the not entirely false claim, I mean, the Trumpian right, that a lot of US big business and capital is against it, because it is, for not surprising reasons. Though, of course, oil and gas and coal, etc., were like firmly behind that project for predictable reasons. So that will vary, considerably, but it's an absolutely crucial variable in terms of whether these positions have any traction, right?
Bom, não apareceram mais questões. Se alguém tem mais alguma, é agora ou nunca. Pelo visto é nunca, porque ninguém se manifestou. Então, eu começo agradecendo ao Fernando e ao Tomás, os nossos tradutores de hoje, pela ajuda inestimável deles. E, aliás, aproveito para agradecer a Teresa e o Gustavo, que foram os nossos tradutores na palestra do Maurício Lazzarato na semana passada, que eu esqueci de agradecer ao final da palestra. Então, Teresa e Gustavo, meu obrigado com uma semana de atraso para vocês. E agradeço ao Alberto, que apesar da hora meio desfavorável, lá onde ele está, aceitou estar com a gente aqui e compartilhar a pesquisa dele com a gente. Alberto, thank you very much.
Thank you all. Let's keep this conversation going, distances notwithstanding.
Let's try and make sure it's not, 5 years until we see each other again? 6 years, however long that was.
Yes.
Let's try and make sure there isn't a global pandemic, another one, in the meantime either. E bom, muito obrigado a todos que vieram. A gente volta daqui a 1h, 1h10, com a palestra da Melinda Cooper, da Australian National University. Então, não esqueçam que hoje a gente tem uma sessão dupla. Muito obrigado, Alberto.
Tchau.
Muito obrigado a todos.
Obrigado.
Tchau, tchau.